When most people think of Canada's history, they think of Confederation in 1867, prime ministers, maybe a few wars. But that is not where this story begins. For thousands of years before Canada existed as a country, this land was home to hundreds of distinct Indigenous nations, each with their own laws, languages, governments, and territories. National Indigenous Peoples Day is not just a cultural holiday. It is a reminder that Canada itself is built on Indigenous lands, Indigenous treaties, and Indigenous survival. In Canada, the term Indigenous peoples usually refers to three main groups: First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. They are not the same, and they are not one single culture. First, First Nations. These are the Indigenous peoples whose traditional territories span most of what is now southern Canada and parts of the north, coast to coast to coast. From Haida and Coast Salish on the Pacific coast, to Cree and Dean across the prairies and boreal forest, to Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee around the Great Lakes, to Mi'kmaq and Innu in the east, these are just a few of the many First Nations. Second, Inuit. Inuit are Indigenous peoples of the Arctic regions, what is now Nunavut, northern Quebec, northern Labrador, and the Northwest Territories, as well as Alaska and Greenland. Their cultures are deeply tied to the sea ice, Arctic animals, and harsh northern environments, developing highly sophisticated knowledge for surviving and thriving in these conditions. Third, Métis. The Métis are a distinct Indigenous people who emerged mainly from the historic relationships between First Nations women and European, especially French and Scottish, fur traders. Over generations, they developed their own collective identity, languages like Michif, political leadership, and homelands, especially around the Red River and across the prairies. They are not simply mixed individuals. They are a recognized Indigenous people with their own history and nationhood. Together, First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples are Indigenous to the lands now called Canada, but their histories go back long before those borders existed. For thousands of years, long before European ships appeared on the horizon, Indigenous peoples built complex societies here. They had systems of governance, councils, confederacies, hereditary chiefs, and clan leaders. They had laws, rules about land use, responsibilities to community, and protocols for making decisions and resolving conflict. They had trade networks stretching across vast distances, long before Canada had roads. On the Pacific coast, nations developed advanced fishing systems, preserving salmon and managing rivers so fish populations could last for generations. On the plains, nations followed and managed bison herds, using every part of the animal: food, clothing, shelter, tools, in a carefully balanced relationship with the land. In the Arctic, Inuit created technologies perfectly adapted to the north: kajaks, parkas, snow houses, sophisticated navigation, and ice knowledge that even modern explorers rely on. In forests and along rivers, nations practiced agriculture, harvesting corn, beans, and squash, managing forests and wetlands, using fire to shape ecosystems. Spirituality, ceremony, and oral traditions connected people to the land, the water, and to each other. This wasn't empty wilderness. It was a world of nations with diplomacy, alliances, and conflict, just like anywhere else on Earth. When Europeans began arriving in larger numbers in the 1500s and 1600s, everything started to change. Slowly at first, then brutally fast. At the beginning, relationships were often based on trade. Indigenous peoples traded furs, food, and knowledge of the land for European goods like metal tools and weapons. Some indigenous nations allied with European powers in wars against rival empires and rival nations. But with European contact came something invisible and deadly: new diseases. Smallpox, measles, influenza, and other diseases spread into communities that had no prior exposure and no natural immunity. In many areas, indigenous populations fell sharply, sometimes by more than half within just a few generations. Historians and demographers don't always agree on exact numbers, and estimates can vary a lot by region and source. But there is broad agreement on this: disease, combined with the impacts of colonial expansion, caused catastrophic population decline. At the same time, European powers, and later the Canadian state, began to push deeper into indigenous lands. Land that had been governed and cared for by indigenous nations for millennia was claimed as Crown land. This wasn't only about disease, it was about land dispossession, resource extraction, and ultimately control. Disease was a major factor, but it was not the only one. The decline and suffering that followed contact were also driven by deliberate policies and decisions. Let's look at some of the major causes. Smallpox and other diseases moved faster than Europeans themselves, traveling along existing trade networks. Communities with no prior exposure were devastated. Some oral histories speak of villages left nearly empty, with only survivors to carry stories forward. As settlers moved in, indigenous nations were pushed off their lands onto smaller territories or reserves. Key hunting territories, fishing rivers, and gathering places were taken over for farms, towns, and industries. When the land is taken, food systems collapse. And when food systems collapse, hunger and poverty follow. On the prairies, after bison were nearly wiped out, often with the knowledge that this would break indigenous resistance, some Canadian officials used food rations as a tool of control. There are documented accounts of leaders and communities forced to sign treaties or obey government demands in exchange for food, while people were already starving. Starvation wasn't just a natural tragedy, it was shaped, and sometimes weaponized by policy. In 1876, the Canadian government consolidated many policies into a single law, the Indian Act. Under this law, the federal government took extensive control over many aspects of First Nations peoples' lives on reserves. Who was recognized as status Indian, how bands chose leaders, how land could be used, and more. Traditional forms of governance were often ignored or replaced, and movement off reserves could be restricted. For decades, the Canadian government banned important ceremonies, like the potlatch on the Pacific coast and the Sundance on the plains. These were not just religious events. They were systems of governance, law, and community life. By criminalizing them, the state tried to break the social and spiritual backbone of many nations. From the 19th century into the late 20th century, the Canadian government and churches ran a system of residential schools for Indigenous children. Many children were taken from their families and forced to live in institutions far from home. They were often punished for speaking their languages or practicing their cultures. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission has described this system as cultural genocide, a deliberate attempt to destroy the cultures and family bonds of Indigenous peoples. Many children experienced abuse, neglect, and hunger. Many never came home. The impacts echo across generations: loss of language, trauma, disconnection from culture, and grief that families are still living with today. Even after the residential school era, Indigenous children have continued to be taken from their families at very high rates by child welfare systems, a crisis often called the 60s scoop and beyond. All of this, disease, land theft, hunger, forced assimilation, legal control, work together to reduce populations and to attack the continuity of Indigenous nations. Despite everything, despite centuries of policies that tried to erase them, Indigenous peoples in Canada are still here. Languages survived in families and communities, even when they were punished in schools. Oral histories continued to pass down knowledge of the land, of treaties, of migrations, and of law. Ceremonies that were once banned are now openly practiced again. Across the country, there is a powerful movement of cultural revival and resistance. Elders and knowledge keepers teaching land-based skills and stories. Communities opening immersion schools to teach children their languages. Artists, writers, filmmakers, and musicians reshaping how Canada understands itself. Leaders and activists challenging pipelines, mines, and projects that ignore Indigenous rights and environmental responsibilities. Indigenous peoples are not just victims of history. They are nations that have adapted, resisted, and rebuilt under some of the most intense pressure any peoples have faced. To understand Canada honestly, You cannot treat Indigenous peoples as a side chapter. They are foundational to this country's existence. First, they are the original peoples of these lands. Every province, every territory, every major city sits on Indigenous land, whether through treaty, unceded territory, or other historical relationships. Second, treaties. Many parts of Canada are governed by formal treaties between Indigenous nations and the Crown, agreements that were meant to be nation to nation, not simple land sales. These treaties still have legal force today and shape Canada's constitutional reality. When Canadians talk about the rule of law, those treaties are part of that law. Third, knowledge of the land and environment. Indigenous knowledge systems, developed over thousands of years, are crucial for understanding ecosystems, climate change, and how to live sustainably on this land. From fire stewardship in forests, to caribou and salmon knowledge, to Arctic ice observation, these are not old myths. They are sophisticated knowledge systems that scientists increasingly recognize and work with. Fourth, identity and culture. Canada often presents itself as a diverse, multicultural country. But any honest Canadian identity must start by recognizing the centrality of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. Their art, languages, stories, and laws are not add-ons to Canada. They are part of the foundation on which the country stands. Finally, truth and reconciliation. Reconciliation is impossible without truth. And the truth is that Canada grew through policies that harmed Indigenous peoples deeply. Recognizing that truth is not about hating Canada. It is about being honest enough to build a better future together. Every year on June 21st, Canada marks National Indigenous Peoples Day. The date falls on or near the summer solstice, a day that has spiritual and cultural significance for many Indigenous peoples. This day exists to recognize and celebrate the cultures, contributions, and histories of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. On the surface, it can look like any other celebration: music, dance, food, speeches. But if it's done with depth, it is much more than that. This day matters because it creates space to honor Indigenous cultures that survived intentional attempts to erase them. It reminds Canadians that Indigenous rights are not special treatment, but the continuation of nation-to-nation relationships and legally recognized rights. It pushes us to remember that celebration must sit alongside truth, memory, and respect, including the painful parts of history: residential schools, child removal, land theft, and more. For non-Indigenous Canadians, National Indigenous Peoples Day is an invitation to learn whose land you live on, to listen to Indigenous voices and leadership, to support language revitalization, land defense, and community initiatives. For Indigenous peoples, the day can be many things: pride, grief, resistance, joy, remembrance. It is not the same for everyone, and it should never be reduced to a single storyline. Long before there was a Canada, there were nations here, governing, trading, telling stories, raising children, and caring for the land. Colonization tried to erase them through disease, hunger, land theft, and cultural destruction, but it failed. Today, First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples are rebuilding languages, defending lands, reshaping law, and reimagining what this country could be. National Indigenous Peoples Day is not just a holiday on the calendar, it is a test of honesty. Will Canada continue to tell a story that starts in 1867? Or will it finally recognize that the first story, the oldest story, belongs to the Indigenous peoples of this land? Because the future of Canada, its land, its laws, its identity, cannot be written without them.